Hello everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the course, where we are going to take a look at student affairs and academic affairs best practices. So first, just a couple of real quick housekeeping items. Please take a quick look at the week number 3 discussion board and make sure you engage in that. Also, as was the case with week number 1 and week number 2, I'm going to be intentionally very brief with this micro lecture and encourage you to thoroughly read all of the course material for this week. That's where you're going to find all of the detail. I'm just going to do some real quick sort of summarizing and share my personal thoughts about the subject matter in the micro lecture. So taking a real quick dive into student affairs best practices real quick. I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but we obviously started this course with a thorough look at student development theory, which, as I've mentioned before, is an intentional decision. And I say that because student affairs best practices are, again, very centered in student development theory and student development best practices. So as you're sort of thinking about student affairs best practices, I would encourage you to give some consideration to student development, and hopefully you're seeing those connections once again. As we discussed last week, learning that occurs outside of the classroom is a real hot topic within student affairs best practices right now. So please start thinking about how institutions might integrate both classroom learning and out of classroom learning experiences, how those can be either separate opportunities or co-curricular opportunities, but leading towards the same end goals. Another best practice, real hot topic, is communities. And by communities, I really mean the broad sense of living learning communities, identity-based communities, establishing a community ideology within an institutional environment, etc. A lot of the research has indicated that students that feel like they have an affinity group, students that feel like they're connected to a particular, identity-based or topically based, community of folks on campus, really are going to do better both academically, socially, and will persist and graduate at a much higher rate. I'm not going to go too much into diversity and inclusion because we're going to have an entire week devoted to the subject, but needless to say, super hot topic within student affairs best practices. I'm going to leave it at that for now because we're going to, again, devote a tremendous amount of time to it. I want to pause for a minute and chat about career development. This has been something obviously that's not new within higher education, but I'm sure you're seeing a lot more attention being devoted to what I call sort of outcome management and making sure that we're not just producing students that have degrees and that have credentials, but that have careers, that are getting placed in graduate school, that have co-curricular opportunities, especially in their senior year, and that really are making connections to a career path. When we survey students nationally, one of the hot things that keeps coming up, and not shockingly a lot of parents as well, is that they really don't just want education for education's sake. They're really interested in outcomes, they're interested in what they're going to do for a living, that they're going to be employed gainfully, etc. Finally, we're going to look at this in a couple minutes, but start thinking about collaboration opportunities with our student affairs colleagues and our academic affairs colleagues as well, and how those worlds can sort of come together. Moving on to a quick look at academic affairs best practices. Not shockingly, and again, this is why we sort of designed the course in the linear fashion that we do, academic affairs best practices rely heavily and borrow heavily from learning environments and from learning theory and from best practices that we discussed last week in terms of how to, properly design a learning environment. Super hot topics within best practices currently, and really frankly for a long time, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on academic advising and how we're helping students progress through a degree using academic advising, using faculty mentorship, using systems and tools to our advantage in order to help students stay on track, help students understand what their requirements are, help students sequence courses properly. There's a big national emphasis. Oregon is certainly not an exception to this, to try and make sure that students are getting a degree as efficiently as they possibly can. So you're going to hear a lot of things about credit bloat and students taking excessive credits and an attempt to try and get students through an education as quickly and as inexpensively as possible. Similarly to student affairs best practices, you see a lot of attention being paid to outcomes, right? So again, the days of go to college, get a degree just to get an education are really over. And more students every year are much more interested in what they're going to do for a living and practical application of their educational experience. Moving on to a quick look at collaboration opportunities. Needless to say, there are a tremendous number of opportunities for academic affairs world and the student affairs world to peaceably coexist, but move beyond just peaceably coexisting and really move into a collaborative mode. One of the common things that we see are what I call connective learning opportunities or connective learning environments. So those are things like intentionally structuring opportunities outside of the classroom that are designed to not only replicate, but also enforce and enhance things that are being learned inside of the classroom. So intentionally linking, for example, coursework with clubs and organizations, linking arts events and opportunities and cultural events and opportunities outside of the classroom with things that are being taught and learned inside of the classroom. So you're going to see a lot more emphasis, I think, on that in future years as well. As we talked about, career placement, career connections, career opportunities are really becoming crucial for both the academic affairs world and the student affairs world because they're crucial for the student world. So thinking about who has the expertise necessary to connect students, what the role of faculty and faculty advisors and mentors are in terms of career placement versus career professionals, and just thinking about how that synthesis sort of works and what types of things we can do to help students in that regard. Not shockingly, we are seeing a tremendous amount of emphasis on collaboration for student persistence and student retention. So making sure that students are staying enrolled, making sure that students are staying on task to degree. And again, just think for a moment about how those lines are sort of blurry between what student affairs professionals and academic affairs professionals, especially faculty, sort of what their roles play in terms of student engagement and student persistence. And again, this is also going to be something we're going to talk about in a minute when it comes to, possible competition, but resource allocation and how academic affairs and student affairs share resources is becoming a hot collaborative topic. So where do we have efficiencies that we can gain? How can we share, everything from space to equipment to rooms to everything sort of along those lines, and how we can use staff to help with teaching and how we can use faculty to help with things that would be more regularly relegated to staff work. And just sort of thinking about blurring the lines between what we would normally consider academic affairs work versus student affairs work. So certainly, as we just chatted about, there are plenty of opportunities for collaboration, but unfortunately, but not surprisingly, there are a lot of things that come into conflict traditionally between the academic affairs and the student affairs worlds. These are really just a few of them, but I have found that competition for scarce resources is probably the most prevalent conflict item that we're seeing occur. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not shocking that especially within the world of public higher education, funding is low. It's at a proportionally historic low point right now and has been for a few years. And in those types of environments, institutions need to try and figure out efficiencies and figure out cost savings, and hence we have an environment of scarce resources. This often, I found, creates an environment in which we have the we-them sort of opportunity. And oftentimes faculty tend to sort of shelter and are protective of their world. Student affairs professionals shelter and are protective of their world. And we tend to see a little bit of infighting occur as a result of that competition. Also, needless to say, there's a general lack of role understanding. So a lot of faculty don't frankly understand the student affairs world particularly well and what folks within the administrative ranks and within the staff ranks sort of do for a living. And likewise, I think a lot of student affairs professionals and other higher education professionals don't have a full appreciation for what it's like to be in the classroom, for what it's like to advise students. So that, needless to say, creates conflict. Certainly, hot topic of conflict at most institutions is space utilization, space management. Who gets the most optimal space, who gets to schedule things, where and when. Needless to say, like scarce resources, that creates competition overlap and just creates an environment in which there could be potential conflict. And finally, I'll leave you with what I sort of put in the rules and regulations sort of world. I have generally found a lot of faculty aren't particularly interested in the minutia of administration, right? They don't want to be bothered with financial aid rules and regulations, with Veterans Administration rules and regulations. But more and more every single year, those types of rules and regulations are creeping into the academic environment. And we're finding ourselves more and more having to engage faculty to help us with our work. So just a quick example of that, there are a lot of newish reporting requirements with the federal government when it comes to financial aid and whether or not students are attending class and are engaging. So we have to rely upon faculty for that type of information. And it's just layering another thing that we're requesting of them past what they want to do, which is primarily to teach. So you can sort of, I think, hopefully see where that can create some conflict. So I know that was quick, but I want to just leave you with a couple of conclusion thoughts from me. As we've talked about multiple times, although learning is still done a lot in the classroom, think beyond, please, please, please think beyond those confines, okay? So, as we talked about last week, learning can occur everywhere. Strong point of collaboration between academic and student affairs is, again, learning occurs outside of the classroom and inside of the classroom. It's not just inside of the classroom. So really start thinking about how that synthesis can occur and what types of things we can do in both worlds and how they can support one another. Again, not shockingly, common sense practices, around best practices for both academic and student affairs are really underpinned by student development, by student support, by strong sense of communication, by being organized, and by thinking about how you can utilize resources most effectively. Very, very similar points to what we made last week when it came to best practices within learning environments. And again, I'm hoping you're really starting to see the pattern here that regardless of what we're talking about, the basic foundational elements of student development theory and that connection, really sort of exists within both the academic affairs world and the student affairs world. And when we're thinking about best practices in both of those worlds, they have to be student-centered. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.